I have never encountered anyone in the royal family who behaved as improperly as Meghan Markle, and just like that, the illusion shattered. Not cracked, shattered. Because when those words flashed across screens on April 1st, 2026, the world didn't just pause, it leaned in. Was this a joke? A stunt? A desperate attempt to stir attention? For a few fragile minutes, people clung to denial. But denial doesn't survive truth. And truth, that morning, came dressed in calm composure and razor-sharp precision. Sophie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because what she delivered wasn't noise, it was exposure. This wasn't gossip anymore. This felt like a sealed vault cracking open. Years of silence, suddenly breathing. And what slipped out wasn't misunderstanding. It was pattern. Not mistakes, strategy. Because Sophie didn't describe a woman struggling to adjust, she described a woman positioning herself. Carefully, deliberately, watching, calculating, moving. And the most chilling part? It wasn't what Meghan did, it was who she was watching. William, not Harry, not the role she was given, not the title she married into. No, according to Sophie, that was never the destination. That was the detour, the consolation prize. Because behind closed doors, behind polite smiles and public unity, something else was unfolding. Something quieter, sharper, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. And Sophie knew where to look. She wasn't trying to belong, Sophie revealed, her words landing with surgical clarity. She was trying to position herself. Let that sink in. Not belong, position. That changes everything. Because suddenly, those early public moments, they don't look so innocent anymore. The lingering touches, the subtle leaning in, the way Meghan would close the physical gap just a little too much. Not enough to cause a scene, but enough to create a picture, a narrative, a suggestion. And here's the question no one asked back then. Why William? Why always William? Because if this was just cultural difference, if this was just American warmth meeting British reserve, then why did the pattern feel selective? Why did it orbit around one person, the future king? Sophie didn't hesitate to answer that. It wasn't unfamiliarity, she said. It was disregard. Not ignorance of the rules, rejection of them. That's where the story turns. Because the monarchy isn't just a family, it's a system. A structure built on invisible codes. You don't have to read them, but you're expected to feel them, respect them, move within them without disturbing the balance. But Meghan didn't move within it. She moved through it. And that's what made people uncomfortable. Not instantly, not loudly, but slowly, repeatedly, undeniably. There were moments, small, almost forgettable on their own. A hand placed too long, a step taken too close, a gaze held just a fraction longer than protocol allows. But patterns don't scream. They whisper until someone connects them. And Sophie connected them. She created a visual closeness, Sophie explained, that wasn't returned. Think about that. Not reciprocated. That means it wasn't mutual. It wasn't natural. It wasn't shared. It was one-sided. And that's where discomfort becomes something else, something sharper. Because when someone keeps crossing a line that isn't being invited, it stops being warmth. It starts becoming intention. And Sophie's words hinted at something even deeper, something darker. She wasn't looking at the role she was given. She was looking at the throne beside it. That's not just ambition. That's redirection. Because ambition within the monarchy is supposed to be silent, controlled, submissive to hierarchy. But this sounded like ambition that refused to wait its turn, and maybe never intended to. Because what Sophie described wasn't a woman adapting to royalty, it was a woman trying to reshape it around herself. She didn't want to follow the system, Sophie said quietly. She wanted the system to follow her. And suddenly, everything begins to make sense. The friction, the tension, the subtle coldness that cameras could never quite capture but audiences could feel. Because behind the polished appearances, there was resistance. Not loud, not explosive, but constant, like a current running beneath still water. And the palace? They didn't react immediately. They observed, they absorbed. Because institutions like this, they don't panic, they record. And what they were recording was a pattern that didn't fade. It intensified. Because once someone realizes the system won't bend, they have two choices: adapt or escalate. And according to Sophie, Meghan didn't adapt. She escalated. But that's where things start to get dangerous. Because what begins as subtle positioning doesn't stay subtle forever. It evolves, it pushes further, it risks more. And the question is, how far did it go before the palace finally decided enough was enough? Because if what we've heard so far is just the surface, then what lies underneath might be far more explosive than anyone expected. And that's exactly where the silence inside the palace stopped being patience and started becoming pressure. Because what Sophie revealed next wasn't just about awkward moments or blurred boundaries, it was about escalation that refused to stay hidden. The kind of escalation that forces as an institution built on restraint to finally acknowledge what it has been quietly containing. Because once patterns repeat, once discomfort becomes documented, once whispers turn into internal reports, it stops being speculation. It becomes evidence. And Sophie, without ever raising her tone, made it clear. There was evidence. She didn't describe isolated incidents. She described a trail, a sequence, a ledger of moments that, when stitched together, painted something far more deliberate than coincidence. And the most unsettling part, these moments weren't happening in shadows. They were happening in public, just subtle enough to avoid outrage, but clear enough to create meaning. Because that's how you rewrite perception. You don't break the system loudly, you bend it quietly until people start questioning what they're seeing. The garden party, just days after the wedding, a moment that should have symbolized entry into the family. Instead, according to Sophie, it marked the beginning of something else entirely. Not a formal nod, not a respectful distance, but a lingering cheek kiss, a grip that stayed a second too long. And William's reaction? Immediate, controlled, but unmistakable. A stiffness, a shift, a silent signal that something had crossed a line that should never have been approached. No words spoken. But in that world, silence speaks louder than confrontation. Then came the Buckingham Palace engagement. Cameras rolling, smiles exchanged, everything appearing exactly as it should, until it wasn't. Because a hand placed on William's back, flat, deliberate, almost guiding, transformed the moment. Not dramatic enough for headlines, but significant enough for those watching closely. And William again, adjusting, stepping away, reclaiming space without creating a scene. Because that's what duty looks like, it absorbs discomfort without exposing it. But Sophie didn't present these as innocent missteps. She framed them as repetition, persistence, intent. It wasn't a one-off, she stated. It was a pattern, and patterns don't exist without purpose. Because if this was accidental, it would fade. If it was misunderstanding, it would correct itself. But according to Sophie, it didn't. It continued. It evolved. It became more confident, more visible, almost as if testing how far it could go without triggering consequence. And that's when the narrative shifts from discomfort to disruption. Because Sophie introduced something far more explosive than physical gestures: motivation. Why keep pushing boundaries that aren't being welcomed? Why maintain proximity that isn't being returned? Why build a visual narrative that contradicts reality? Her answer was chilling in its simplicity. It was about signaling, not feeling, not connection. Signaling, creating an image, crafting an association, a quiet suggestion planted into public perception that there was closeness where there wasn't, alignment where there wasn't, chemistry where there absolutely wasn't. And in a world driven by images, sometimes perception matters more than truth. But inside the palace, truth is everything. And once that truth starts being manipulated, the system doesn't react emotionally, it reacts structurally. Because behind the scenes, Sophie revealed something the public barely understood at the time. Documentation had already begun. Reports, notes, observations, not for punishment, but for record. Because the monarchy doesn't move on impulse. It builds cases, quietly, carefully. And what they were building wasn't flattering. Late-night messages bypassing formal channels, direct communication that ignored hierarchy, attempts to insert influence where it wasn't granted, moments of overfamiliarity not just with William, but extending outward towards senior figures, towards staff, toward the very structure that defines the institution. And Sophie's words cut through all ambiguity. This wasn't modernization. This was disruption packaged as charm. She treated it like a network, Sophie implied, not a system. And that's the fundamental misunderstanding. Because the monarchy isn't a place where you climb by visibility. You don't gain position through presence. You earn it through endurance, through silence, through consistency. And when someone enters that world trying to accelerate what cannot be rushed, friction isn't just inevitable, it's guaranteed. But what happens when friction doesn't slow someone down? It redirects them. And that's where Sophie's account takes its most unsettling turn. Because once it became clear that William wasn't responsive, that the line couldn't be crossed, that the boundary would not move, the strategy changed. It didn't stop. It shifted. It was no longer about entering the inner circle, Sophie revealed. It was about isolating one member from it, Harry. And suddenly the story isn't just about positioning anymore. It's about control. Because isolation doesn't happen loudly. It happens gradually. Conversations delayed, invitations declined, communication rerouted, until one person becomes the filter, the interpreter, the gatekeeper of reality itself. And Sophie didn't hesitate to describe it that way. A blockade, she called it. Not physical, psychological. Because if you can't change the system, you change the person inside it. And Harry, according to Sophie, became that person. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, until the lines that once connected him to his family began to fade. Not broken in a single moment, but eroded over time. And erosion is harder to detect, because by the time you realize something is missing, it's already gone. Requests to meet becoming we're busy. Conversations becoming we need space. Decisions no longer sounding like his own, but echoing something else. Something external. Something newly dominant. She became the lens through which he saw everything, Sophie stated. And that changes everything. Because once someone controls the lens, they control the narrative. And once they control the narrative, they control the outcome. Which brings us to the moment that didn't just shock the palace, it redefined the conflict entirely. The Oprah interview, not as an emotional release, not as a cry for understanding, but as something far more calculated. A launch, Sophie implied. A public declaration that the bridge wasn't just burned, it was meant to be seen burning. And from that point forward, the monarchy didn't retaliate. It withdrew. Not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Because engaging would feed it, responding would amplify it. And the palace, as Sophie revealed, chose something far more powerful than confrontation. Silence. Cold. Absolute. Final. Doors closed without announcement. Invitations evaporated without explanation. Roles dissolved without negotiation. Titles remained, but stripped of function, stripped of influence, stripped of access. They have the name, Sophie said, but not the place. And that's the quietest form of exile, the kind that doesn't need to be declared. Because by 2025, the shift was undeniable. The monarchy, still standing, still steady, refined by pressure rather than broken by it. And the narrative that once threatened to destabilize it, losing momentum, losing impact, losing credibility, not through attack, through absence. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. Because stories like this don't end with explosions. They end with silence. The kind of silence that leaves questions hanging, unresolved, unanswered, echoing long after the cameras stop rolling. Because even now, one question refuses to disappear. Was this ever about fitting into the system? Or was it all